Hey, Buck.
How you doing?
Good. How are you? Nice to see you again.
Yeah, nice to see you.
Yeah, it feels like it's been a long time since we've spoken. Both of us are running in 100 directions.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now you're in sunny subtropical California, right?
Yeah, I'd say I don't know if tropical, but it's definitely warmer than Vancouver. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Santa
Well,
Barbara, California.
yeah. Well, this week is nice here in Vancouver, so we're counting our blessings.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that we can get to it, and our guests, our listeners, know who we're speaking to. This is Buck Joffrey. Buck is an expert in many things and a real businessman. So no theorists on this show. But Buck, why don't you give us some context about your personal and professional life that brings you to be interviewed on the Cabinet Maker Profit System podcast?
Sure. Well, I don't know if on the first sight it would be a natural fit, but I actually started out. I'm a surgeon. I'm a surgeon by trade, and um, it's funny because the first time I ever used a drill, this is true.
Yeah. Oh no, trepanation.
No, I did. The first time I ever used a drill in my life, I was drilling through somebody's head because I started out as a neurosurgeon. And
Boom! You just started this interview with a grabber.
yeah, yeah. So that is true. I grew up. My dad is a real estate investor. He's been a real estate investor for 40, 50 years.
Hmm.
But I used to look at him and say, "Gosh, that's the last thing I want to do." And so I actually went to med school and ended up becoming a surgeon. And so it's funny. In reality, being a surgeon, though, is a little bit different than I think a lot of people think about. Like, well, wow, you mean neurosurgery or head and neck surgery or whatever, all these things that are out there. I actually feel very much similar to probably the way some of your cabinet makers feel, because at the end of the day, I was I work with my hands. That's what I did, and I did
Yeah.
this thing over and over, and you get better at doing the same things over. So I relate very much with that part of the population.
Yeah. Well, the reason I brought you on the show is because of your notoriety and the things that you talk about, which is wealth. But creating ongoing wealth by monetizing what you know. I heard you on another podcast that I listened to. I think you were with Jonathan Levi,
Yeah, yeah.
and you're talking about monetizing what you know. And I thought, I have to have you talking to our group, because our guys, just like you said, they're experts and they're really good at what they do. But there's a challenge of getting stuck in that same loop of just saying, I'm a cabinet maker, I'm an architectural woodworker, I'm just going to keep doing that,
Yeah.
and not giving themselves the opportunities for more.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think what I'm focused on is trying to figure out how do you expand your means. I think that's really, probably the best message I can and potentially value add to your folks, which is, if you're a cabinet maker, successful cabinet maker business, you're making a lot of money, and the question is, what do you do with it, right? And this is a question that is actually much more prevalent than you might think. You're a cabinet maker, all of a sudden you're starting to make six figures.
Hmm.
What do you do with it? And the same thing goes for a surgeon who comes out of residency making nothing and all of a sudden makes six figures. What do you do with it? And I think the issue is that, so the first impulse for people who come into money for the first time is just to burn right through it, right? Because you're playing a little bit of catch up. You've got all these things that you wanted, you the nice house and the nice car and all these things. And that's not a terrible thing to do to a certain extent. But I think what I like to focus on is the idea that, making money is only the first step, because the way that the wealthy in this world really get there is by taking that first chunk of cash and turning it into a lot more cash, right?
Hmm.
And a lot more assets and things like that. And so, that's really kind of what my focus is on. Let me just give you one example. Say you just, you started making a chunk of money and you really wanted a Maserati. Okay. And
Of
I don't know,
course.
about $120,000 or something like that, right?
Yeah.
That's great. You might buy that Maserati for $120,000. Here's the problem. The second you buy that Maserati and drive it off the lot, you have zero chance of ever making money on that Maserati. And you have a 100% chance of losing money just by the fact that it'll depreciate to zero. Now, let's take this scenario back and say, now, let's take that $120,000 and let's first expand your means. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's turn that $120,000 into something that pays you a dividend, a cash flow of $1,200 a month. Well, now you can still have your Maserati because now you're paying for it with your asset that's paying you. And once the Maserati's gone, guess what? You still have that payment paying you. That's called expanding your means first. And then, listen, I don't believe in skipping the latte. That is a bunch of BS. No one wants to live like that. You didn't work hard to get there. All I'm just saying is take an extra step, expand your means, then live in that new means. That's the way I think it's a paradigm shift for most.
It is a paradigm shift. One of the first places that I have conversations with people in this industry is, do you own your building or do you lease it or do you rent it?
Right.
I learned this from my uncle, the old Italian guy who came over with nothing and worked as a welder. And he said, look, Dominic, the first day you rent and the last day you rent are the most expensive days in your life.
Right.
But the first day you buy the building is the most expensive and it gets cheaper after that.
Yeah.
Because I eventually am going to own that building.
Sure.
And then I see business owners that do that. And eventually, when it comes time to sell the company, even if it's passing on within family or management buyout, there's two assets. There's the company and there's the building.
That's right. That's right. So what you really need to focus on, I think, is, how do I, and then that goes back to expanding means, right? You're going to put a chunk of money on the first day in that building that you just talked about. And then you're going to pay rent, but that rent is paying down your mortgage. It's building equity. And you also get the benefit of the appreciation on the back end. So it's just, again, it's just one more step that you don't really think about.
Yeah. How do you, the multi-generational question comes up a lot, especially in this industry, because it's not uncommon for, it's a male-dominated industry. We can say that here because it is.
So is surgery.
So surgery. Yeah. I mean, things are changing, but right now, a guy starts a cabinet making shop or an architectural millwork shop, and then he brings in his son or his nephew's brother, family in some way. But then there's this multi-generational thing that happens where he's going to pass it on to somebody else within the family. How do you deal with educating that multi-generational viewpoint on this?
I think that when you look at, I think it's, I think you learn from what you're around, right? I mean, it's funny because even though I went into medical school and became a surgeon, I remember my dad as I'd watch TV and people were talking about their different types of investing strategies, and I'd say, Dad, what's your investing strategy? And all he would say is cash flow. I'd say, okay, whatever that means. Of course, when Robert Kiyosaki wrote this, book, in the 90s, everybody was talking about cash flow. But my dad has been talking to me about this since the 80s, and I never paid any attention to him. So I think part of it is, listen, when you learn and you behave a certain way, you're doing that not only for you, but you're doing that as for your kids, right? Because this stuff is not necessarily intuitive, right? It's not. No one tells you exactly how you're supposed to create wealth, and in reality, the conventional financial wisdom that's out there, which is Wall Street, is made by Wall Street. What they're going to tell you is just to give us your money, give the wealth advisors your money. Why? Because it plans their retirement. And that's really the difference, right? Is so what we're saying here, what I like to say is, especially with small business people, you're smart, you're creative, you're industrious, you've created something that is actually throwing off a bunch of money. It's actually not that hard to simply put your business acumen to work to learn how to make your money make more money for you, right? Robert Kiyosaki's famous for saying that whole, basically that your money's going to work for you rather than you working for money. And that's basically the concept. So,
yeah. I don't know what the market's like in Santa Barbara. Here in Vancouver, the real estate market is insane. Just today or yesterday, I heard that a 153 square foot condo in Hong Kong went for $300,000. 153 square feet. They were saying that's about the size of a parking spot. And it's the same in Australia and parts of the United States as well, down there in the Silicon Valley. If real estate is so front of mind for people as the cash flow tool, are there other ones in places where we've got such crazy real estate prices it might feel hard to jump in?
Well, first of all, let's back up, because there's one thing that's really important to remember is when I watched my dad own a bunch of real estate and the phone ring off the hook with toilets, termites, and tenants, the last thing on earth I ever wanted to do was to be a landlord, right? But here's a major shift that happened when I started really doing research. Now, listen, the wealthiest people in the world who are investing in real estate are not investing and then getting calls from tenants, right? There's a way to invest in real estate just the way there's a way to invest in stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, which is effectively some kind of a turnkey situation, whether that be turnkey real estate where you're buying individual homes, or if you are participating in what's called a syndication. Now, so private placements. So people in your listeners, a number of them basically might qualify for what's being called an accredited investor.
Yeah.
An accredited investor in Canada, I think, has similar meaning to what it is in the U.S. But you have to make $200,000 per year, or you have a net worth of $1 million outside of your personal residence. That's all it is. So accredited, you're either accredited or you're not. It's sort of like being pregnant. You don't apply. You just are, right? You just are or you aren't. And if you meet that criteria, then this whole world opens up to you, where you can invest in private placements and you can invest alongside others who are doing all the work. And so you still have ownership, but you have fractional ownership.
Right.
You get all the benefits, but you don't have to do all of the dirty work, and you don't have to have the expertise. But I bring that up because, remember, I'm talking about passive real estate investing. I don't encourage any of your listeners who are busy professionals, who are really good at what they're doing, making a lot of money, to go out there and start looking for properties on them. I mean, that's just creating another job for yourself, and you're more than likely going to lose money as you learn this. If you don't want to do that, I tell my surgeon listeners the same thing. Listen, you do what you do. All we're saying is, once you get to that point, you're making money, don't give it to Wall Street. Don't give it to a wealth advisor. Just figure out, how you can get your money into real assets.
Right.
That's the major difference. Now, those real assets, of course, now it doesn't matter if you're investing with others and in turnkey, et cetera. If that property is in Vancouver, in Santa Barbara, I just put together was part of a deal in Phoenix with a group from Vancouver. Believe it or not. None of the investors, we raised a lot of money, and none of the investors, very few investors, were actually living in Phoenix. You see? So you live where you want to live, you invest where it makes sense.
Yeah. Let me write that down. You live where you want to live, invest where it makes sense. Love it. So, our listeners are listening to this and they're like, I always promise to bring them the kind of information they wouldn't normally find in the trades that they're in, because usually they're being delivered technical information.
Sure.
And I believe in bringing business-minded information. How do they learn more about this if this is even something they want to pursue? Are there keywords that they type into Google to find info, or what should they do?
Well, you could, for one thing, obviously this is the kind of stuff I talk about all the time on my podcast, Wealth Formula Podcast, wealthformula.com. But, I think the way to look at it, some of the keywords that we're talking about is, what is a real estate syndication, right? That would be it. Or search the terms turnkey real estate. And if you do those types of things, you'll find a lot of these things. Now, I do want to point out that this is where you have to know something. And it's different from what you'd think, because number crunching is easy. Because again, listen, this isn't brain surgery.
The first place you used a drill.
Yeah, the first place I used the drill. This is actually just arithmetic, right? It's usually just arithmetic. But the challenge is anybody can do the arithmetic. The real question is, who are the right providers? Who are the turnkey providers that you can trust? Who are the syndicators that you can trust? And that's where I think this idea of investing that the way I approach it is very different. I invest in the people almost more than I invest in the project, right? Because you can make anything look good on paper, but if you trust the people, you can actually trust that paper. And so investing is a team sport. There's no question about it. And I use the term tribe to describe how I invest. I call it tribal investing. And so part of my group is a group of accredited investors. And what we do is it's almost sort of like crowd intelligence, right? Think about it that way. You have a bunch of good experiences with a certain type of investment or a company that does turnkey real estate. We all get to know that they perform and that they're honest and that they have integrity. And if they don't, guess what? Everybody knows that too.
Yeah.
And so that's leveraging crowd intelligence. And that is one of the most important things that you're going to find when you invest.
What's this acronym, tribe investing? Does T stand for something?
I call it tribal investing. And I just think of it this way. What is a tribe, right?
Yeah.
Tribe is a group of people who speak the same language because they've been educated the same way. And in my case, with my listeners, we talk the same language on my podcast because that's what we're talking about all the time.
Right.
And then there's this sort of, there's just this desire to make sure that your reputation stays clean and to do well by other members in the tribe so that they trust you and you trust them. And there's a mutual benefit in performance. Right. And so that's one of the most important things I've learned over the last decade.
So I love that. And the first thing that I think our listeners are saying is, how do I find out who to trust and who not to?
Yeah.
Sure.
And part of that's a leap of faith initially, right? But what a lot of times what you'll find, the way I started finding people like that myself is almost by accident, right? Because I had a guy, for example, I had a guy who I called for a mortgage to ask about a mortgage on my on an apartment building once. It was a small apartment building, and so the bigger banks didn't want to do that kind of deal. And so he and I got to talking. We finally ultimately closed on it. He and I stayed in touch. We became friends. And the next thing you know, I realized, this guy actually has a fund. Okay. He said, were you interested in investing in the fund? Well, I got to know the guy well enough and go, okay, yeah, I'll put in some money. Well, he paid me like clockwork every day or every month, never missed a beat. He and I became friends. So it wouldn't have been right for him. Not, you know what I mean?
Right.
And next thing you know, I referred a bunch of people to him because
how he operates. He does what he says.
And so people who were part of my quote unquote tribe were exposed to him. Now it's never a guarantee, but I can tell you that I had money with him and I never lost money, right? It's a pretty good place to start. The last place you want to start is Google. Right?
Well, Google, you have to start somewhere.
Well, right. But you can learn the terms, but don't ever pick your investments off of Google is what I'd tell you.
Yeah.
So that snowballs though, Dominic, because what happens is, here I am, almost a decade later of this whole, creating wealth and buying buildings, and my network and my tribe is really big. So basically that's how I invest. And my investor club, which is the accredited investor group that I have, anybody can join it if you meet the criteria financially.
Right.
basically they are exposed to all of my network, and then occasionally I'll hear about something from them. I'll do my own due diligence, and if it makes sense, then we'll do something with that person, and that expands the community even more. But
Yeah.
here's the thing: this is how the wealthiest, the ultra wealthy, do it. They don't do it on a whim. They don't hand over checks to wealth advisors. It's all like, wealthy people making other wealthy people more wealthy. That's how it works.
Yeah.
And so if you can play the game, it will work for you too. If you're making, decent money, you don't have to be a multimillionaire to play this game. If you're making six figures, and you want to get out of this stupid conventional financial wisdom play, that's what you do.
Just as I was asking you the question and listening to your answer, it occurred to me that the place to find people that you could potentially know, like, and trust is by listening to podcasts like this. You have a podcast. So in my mind, I'm thinking I need to actually move you higher up in my playlist because I'm going to hear you talking to other people, and I'm going to hear other people on that podcast, or I'm going to hear you, and I'm going to get ideas, and thoughts become feelings, feelings become actions, actions become my success. Right. And that path goes either way. That either goes up or it goes down, or I guess it also goes flat. Yeah. So if I think I want to be around people, if I want to be a wealthier person with positive cash flow, working when I'm not working, I need to be around those people. And one of the easiest ways is listening to podcasts like ours or reading our blogs, etc.
I think that's important because most people, if you're doing well and you're living in a nice little neighborhood, and you're part of that upper middle class or whatever you want to call it, your neighbors could care less about this stuff, right? It's very difficult to just find a community. A good place to find the community these days is through podcasting, through, forums, etc. And I think that's, that certainly for my listeners is, I think, a big thing. They think of their real life, and then there's this virtual life. And the virtual life, they can really tailor to the interests that they have. Right. And creating wealth outside of Wall Street is a big one for us.
I don't know if you know this, but my business partner is a gentleman by the name of Brian Tracy. And Brian is a really well-known author and speaker in the world of business improvement, sales improvement, etc. One of the things that he always says is turn your car into a university. Because we're spending time in the car anyways, driving to work or driving back and forth from appointments. A university course is the equivalent of 40 hours of listening to lectures, plus additional work you might do with TAs. On an average year, I'm going to drive, even if I only drive an hour a day, 200 hours.
Yeah.
And so I could get 5 university courses or that kind of education time in. So I don't listen to the radio anymore. I listen to podcasts. I know that's a bit geeky, but I want my life to be a certain way so that my kids have a certain life as well. And so I listen to podcasts like yours and other ones so that I learn and I don't just waste my time listening to burp fart radio.
Yeah. I mean, that's the way I am too. I mean, honestly, I think podcast listeners are, we're a certain type too. I think it's getting bigger and bigger, the audience, the podcast audience, but right now we're still pretty unique. And, but it does attract a certain type of person, which is like somebody who is inherently curious, right? Mm-hmm. Wants to learn more about the world. And podcasts are a great place to do it, and you don't have to listen to every one. You just go through titles and you see names that might resonate. Like on my podcast, for example, getting a lot of people who go to the Robert Kiyosaki interview, because they know who Robert Kiyosaki is. So I would highly encourage that. One of the reasons I actually started a podcast, Dominic, is because I couldn't find one podcast for me that seemed to really speak to me. And who am I? Well, I'm a guy who, I was doing pretty well. I wasn't broke. And a lot of podcasts are always talking about, getting on, escaping the cubicle or whatever. And if anything, I was looking to escape golden handcuffs, not, a rat race or a cubicle.
Yeah.
And so not very many people are out there talking to people who are working and making good money because nobody feels bad for them. But
Oh, we like taxing you guys. That's what happens all the time. Let's tax those guys.
Tax those guys. Right. But your listeners, a lot of them are making good money, and some of them might be wondering, gosh, what am I doing wrong here? Everything, I'm just, it seems like the more money I make, the more I spend. So I'm right where I started.
Yeah. Or you can only buy a nicer truck and a nicer quad on a nicer cottage on a nicer lake so many times before you go, what do I do now?
Yeah.
And I think you're right about the curiosity is the people that listen to podcasts do want to know different things at a deeper level.
Yeah.
That's the nice thing about podcasts. You can hone right in on what you're interested in and find a topic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Buck, if people want to find out more about you or listen to your podcast, did you say you did a podcast with Robert Kiyosaki?
Yeah. It was about a month ago.
Oh, good for you. That's great. So some of the listeners here might not know who Robert Kiyosaki is, the author of Rich Dad. I'll let you, why don't you tell us a little bit about that? And if our listeners want to come to your podcast, they can do that.
Yeah. So the Robert Kiyosaki is, I consider sort of, a big major influence on me. He's the number one financial author of all time. He wrote this book back in the 90s called Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which is the number one selling financial book of all time. I actually prefer a book that he wrote called The Cash Flow Quadrant, which I would highly recommend to your readers. And so Robert's philosophy is very similar to mine. I think where my podcast and information that I provide is what I consider sort of the next step, because that's what I wanted. I had a mindset shift based on what Robert's book said, and I was like, okay, now what? And I didn't have a roadmap for that, and that's what I wanted to create. And so that's what Wealth Formula Podcast is about. Another thing that you can do if you want to kind of get a feel at 1,000 feet of what this world is about and this real asset investing in a very basic terms, you can just download my book at wealthformula.com. It's called 7 Secrets of Eternal Wealth. You can also actually just text, what is it? Or, I can't remember what it is. So you're going to have to go to...
I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
But if we go to your website,
wealthformula.com.
Okay.
Yeah. And if you go to wealthformula.com and you can download 7 Secrets of Eternal Wealth. And I'm just seeing, but anyway, I'll give you that text number and later, and you can easily just download it as well from your phone if you just text me for it. So
okay, well that's fantastic. I love this. I think this is the kind of different flavored information that our listeners need, because they're all business owners. They're all working really hard and doing well, but want to do better. And once you're doing better, you have to do something else with the money than just the normal burn it. It's time to invest and be smart about it. It's funny, as you were talking, it reminds me of a really old book called The Richest Man in Babylon. Have you ever read that book? Mm-hmm. Great book, old book, but it still holds so true, is that just it's investing wisely with people you trust, know, like, and trust is right. It just holds true. It's not some TV ad that's telling you invest with this and we're smarter than everybody. They're not. They've got the same tools as everybody else. We have to rely on ourselves and our knowledge. All right, sir. Well, thank you so much for joining us here on the Cabinet Maker Profit System podcast. Maybe one day I can come and talk to your listeners and see if they want to hear from the trade side of the world.
Yeah. Very good. Thanks for having me, Dominic.
Yeah, you have a great day. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We appreciate your time, and we'll talk to you all soon.